Part 3. The Doctrine. Clarity as Stewardship. Chapter 7. Clarity is a responsibility, not a gift. There is another subtle misunderstanding that often shapes how people approach communication. Many treat clarity as a talent, something a person either has or does not have. In this view, some are naturally clear, while others are simply not good at explaining things. As a result, clarity is reduced to personality or preference. But this is not accurate. Clarity is not a gift, it is a responsibility. And this responsibility begins the moment you are entrusted with something to communicate, whether that is truth, knowledge, vision, or instruction. If God gives you a message, you are responsible for how that message is delivered. Not just that it is spoken, but that it is understood. This is where many people fall short. They assume that once something has been said, their role is complete. But communication does not end with expression. It ends with understanding. If what you say is not understood, then the assignment is not complete. This is not about perfection, it is about stewardship. Scripture consistently reveals that those who are given something are accountable for how they handle it. Whether it is knowledge, influence, or responsibility, it is not given casually. It is entrusted. And what is entrusted must be handled with care. This includes how it is communicated. Because when something meaningful is communicated poorly, its value is diminished, not in itself, but in its ability to reach others. Truth does not lose its power, but its impact is limited when it is not made clear. This is where clarity becomes a matter of stewardship. To carry a message is to carry responsibility. And part of that responsibility is ensuring that the message is not lost in the process of communication. It must not be buried under unnecessary complexity. It must not be hidden behind language that creates distance. It must not be presented in a way that prevents understanding. Because when that happens, what was meant to help others becomes inaccessible to them. This principle applies across every domain. In teaching, if knowledge is not made clear, students struggle, not because they are incapable, but because the communication has failed them. In leadership, if direction is not made clear, teams become misaligned, not because they lack commitment, but because they lack understanding. In business, if value is not made clear, the market does not respond, not because the offering is weak, but because it has not been understood. And in ministry, if truth is not made clear, people cannot receive it, not because they are unwilling, but because they cannot grasp it. In each case, the issue is not the absence of substance, it is the absence of clarity. This is why clarity must be approached intentionally. It is not enough to know something. It is not enough to feel strongly about something. It must also be communicated in a way that others can understand. This requires effort. It requires thought. It requires refinement. It requires the discipline to remove what is unnecessary so that what is essential can be seen. This is not always easy, but it is necessary. My role as a strategic communicator is not simply to express ideas. It is to translate them, to take what I know and present it in a way that can be received, to bridge the gap between what is in my mind and what can be understood by others. This is where my work as a cinematic strategist becomes relevant. In my book, The Cinematic Strategist: How to Win Trust and Authority, Lead with Conviction, Command Attention, and Transform Your Brand's Narrative from a Cost into a Capital Asset, I describe the gap between strategy and execution, the space where meaning is often lost. I refer to this as the strategic void. This is not just a business problem, it is a communication problem. It is what happens when something valuable is not translated clearly from one level to another. The strategist understands, but the audience does not. The intention exists, but the expression fails, and in that gap, value is lost. This reinforces the idea that clarity is not optional. If you do not take responsibility for clarity, something will be lost in translation. And what is lost may not be obvious immediately, but it will show up in outcomes. It will show up in misunderstanding. It will show up in hesitation. It will show up in lack of response. And over time, it will show up in reduced impact. There is also a tendency to assume that people will figure it out, that if something is important enough, others will take the time to understand it. But this is not always realistic. People are not only evaluating what is being said, they are also responding to how easily it can be understood. If something requires too much effort to process, it is often set aside, not because it lacks value, but because clarity was not provided. This is why responsibility lies with the communicator. This does not mean oversimplifying to the point of losing meaning. It means simplifying enough to make meaning accessible. It means being intentional about how something is structured, how it is explained, and how it is delivered. It means asking, is this clear? Can this be understood? What might be misunderstood here? These questions are part of stewardship. There is also a personal dimension to this responsibility. Clarity in communication is often a reflection of clarity in thinking. If your thoughts are disordered, your communication will reflect that. If your understanding is incomplete, your expression will reveal it. This means that clarity must first be developed internally. Before you can communicate clearly, you must think clearly. Before you can explain something, you must understand it deeply. This internal clarity becomes the foundation of external clarity. As within, so without. The Mojig's doctrine has consistently emphasized this idea. In Statute 2, the rejection of tactical specialization, we made it clear that our value does not come from isolated skills, but from process mastery. We are not defined by a tool, but by how we think. This is important, because clarity is not just about what you say. It is about how you think before you say it. If your thinking is structured, your communication will be structured. If your thinking is precise, your communication will be precise. Clarity flows from within. So, if you have been given something to communicate, whether it is truth, knowledge, or vision, then clarity is part of your assignment. It is not something to be ignored. It is not something to be assumed. It is something to be practiced, because what you carry is not only for you. It is meant to reach others. And if it is to reach others, it must be clear. Take a moment to consider this. What have you been entrusted with? And how clearly are you communicating it? Are you assuming understanding or ensuring it? Are you expressing or translating? These questions matter because clarity is not a talent reserved for a few. It is a responsibility for anyone who carries something that matters. And when that responsibility is taken seriously, what you carry is no longer hidden. It becomes visible. It becomes accessible. It becomes effective because it is understood. Chapter 8. The Sin of Obscurity. There is a form of failure that does not look like failure. It does not appear as error or incompetence or lack of effort. In fact, it often appears impressive. It sounds intelligent. It carries the language of depth. It creates the impression that something meaningful is being communicated. But when examined closely, it produces no understanding. This is obscurity. And obscurity is not harmless. It is not neutral. It is not a stylistic choice. It is a failure of responsibility. At its worst, it becomes a kind of deception, not necessarily intentional, but real in its effects, because it presents the appearance of clarity while withholding its substance. This is why it must be confronted directly. Obscurity often hides behind complexity. There is a tendency to assume that if something sounds sophisticated, it must be valuable. That if language is dense, it must be deep. That if a message is difficult to follow, it must contain insight. But this is not always true. Complexity can be necessary in some cases, but unnecessary complexity, complexity that does not serve understanding, becomes a barrier. It prevents people from seeing what is actually being said. It creates distance between the message and the listener. It requires effort that is reasonable. And over time, it leads to disengagement. This is not depth, it is obstruction. Jargon plays a similar role. In many fields, specialized language develops as a way to communicate efficiently among those who understand it. But when that language is used without consideration for the audience, it becomes exclusionary. It signals belonging to a group, but it does not always serve understanding. In business, this is common. Terms are used that sound precise, but often lack clear meaning when examined. Phrases are repeated because they are familiar, not because they are helpful. And as a result, communication becomes layered with words that obscure rather than reveal. The message becomes difficult to follow, even when it is important. There is also a more subtle cause of obscurity: pride. Pride does not always appear as arrogance. Sometimes it appears as a desire to appear knowledgeable, to be seen as intelligent, to be recognized for depth. This can lead to communication that prioritizes appearance over understanding. Instead of asking, "Is this clear?" the focus becomes, "Does this sound impressive?" Instead of removing what is unnecessary, more is added. Instead of refining the message, it is expanded in ways that make it harder to grasp. And in this process, clarity is sacrificed. This is where obscurity becomes more than a technical issue. It becomes a moral one. If you carry something that has the potential to help others, and you communicate it in a way that prevents them from understanding it, you have not fulfilled your responsibility. You may have spoken, you may have written, you may have presented, but if understanding has not taken place, the work is incomplete. And if this is done consistently, if complexity, jargon, or pride are allowed to shape communication, then obscurity becomes a pattern. This is why it can be described as a sin, not in the sense of intentional wrongdoing, but in the sense of missing the mark, failing to do what should have been done. This connects directly to the problem you have identified in your work. From this point, I speak to myself. In the cinematic strategists, you describe the gap between those who think and those who execute. The strategist produces a document filled with ideas, frameworks, and language. The vendor takes instructions and produces outputs. But between these two, something is lost. The meaning is not fully translated. The intent is not clearly carried through. The result is work that exists, but does not fully communicate what it was meant to. This is the strategic void, and obscurity plays a central role in its creation. The strategist often operates at a level of abstraction that is not easily translated. The language becomes complex, layered, and difficult to interpret. The ideas may be strong, but they are not made accessible. The vendor, on the other hand, focuses on execution without fully understanding the underlying intent. The output may be polished, but it lacks alignment with the deeper meaning. In both cases, clarity is missing. And when clarity is missing, value is lost. This is not just a business issue, it is a communication issue. It is what happens when responsibility for clarity is not taken seriously. The strategist assumes understanding, the vendor assumes instruction, and the audience receives something that does not fully make sense. This is obscurity in practice. The sin. The consequences are both practical and spiritual. Practically, obscurity leads to inefficiency. Time is spent clarifying what should have been clear from the beginning. Resources are used to correct misunderstandings. Opportunities are lost because the message did not land. It also leads to frustration. People feel uncertain. They hesitate. They question. And over time, trust begins to weaken because unclear communication creates doubts. Spiritually, the implications are deeper. If clarity reflects the nature of God, then obscurity moves away from that alignment. It introduces confusion. It prevents understanding. It interrupts the process through which truth is received and acted upon. If a message is not clear, it cannot be properly received. And if it is not received, it cannot produce transformation. This is why clarity matters so deeply in the communication of truth. Because truth is not only meant to be spoken, it is meant to be understood. There is also a responsibility to examine intent. Not all obscurity is intentional, but some of it is allowed. It is allowed when clarity is not prioritized, when communication is rushed, when the focus is on expression rather than understanding. This is why obscurity must be recognized and addressed, not with judgment, but with awareness. Clarity requires humility. It requires the willingness to simplify, to remove what is unnecessary, to ask whether something can be understood, not just whether it sounds correct. It requires the discipline to refine ideas until they can be expressed clearly, to test communication against understanding, not assumption. This is not always easy, but it is necessary. Take a moment to reflect. Where might you be hiding behind complexity? Where might your language be clear to you, but unclear to others? Where might pride be influencing how you communicate? These are not comfortable questions, but they are important because obscurity does not announce itself. It must be identified. The goal is not to remove depth. The goal is to remove what prevents depth from being seen. Because what is clear can be understood, and what is understood can be received, and what is received can produce change. Obscurity hides value. Clarity reveals it. And if you are entrusted with something that matters, then it must not remain hidden. It must be made clear. Chapter 9: The Stewardship of Influence. Influence is often misunderstood. Many people think of influence as visibility, how people see you, how many people follow you, how many listen when you speak. But influence is not simply about reach, it is about trust. Influence exists where trust exists. A person may be seen by many and trusted by few. In that case, their influence is limited, regardless of their visibility. Another may be seen by fewer people, but deeply trusted by those who listen. In that case, their influence is strong. This is because influence is not measured by how many people hear you, but by how many people believe you. And belief is built on understanding. When people trust you, they are doing more than listening to your words. They are placing confidence in your communication. They are assuming that what you say is not only true, but also clear enough to be relied upon. This is where responsibility begins. If people trust you, you must communicate truth well, not partially, not vaguely, not in a way that leaves room for confusion, but in a way that can be understood, followed, and acted upon. Because once trust is given, the stakes are higher. Your words begin to carry weight. Your ideas begin to shape thinking. Your communication begins to influence decision. And influence, if not handled carefully, can either build or damage. Clarity is what sustains trust. When you communicate clearly, people understand what you mean. They are able to follow your reasoning. They are able to see the connection between what you say and what you intend. This creates confidence. They do not have to guess. They do not have to interpret excessively. They do not have to fill in gaps. They understand. And because they understand, they trust. Over time, this trust deepens. It becomes stable. It becomes reliable. It becomes something people depend on. This is how influence grows. Confusion, on the other hand, weakens trust. When communication is unclear, people begin to question not always your intention, but your reliability. They are unsure of what you mean. They are uncertain about how to interpret your words. They begin to wonder whether they can depend on what you are saying. This uncertainty creates distance, even if the content is correct. The lack of clarity introduces doubt, and doubt erodes trust. This is how influence begins to decline, not through a single failure, but through repeated moments of confusion. This is where clarity must be treated as part of stewardship. To be entrusted with influence is to be entrusted with responsibility. It is not something to be used casually. It is not something to be taken lightly. If people are listening to you, it means they are depending on you to be truthful, depending on you to be accurate, and importantly, depending on you to be clear. Because without clarity, truth cannot be properly received. This applies in every context. In leadership, people look for direction. They rely on what is communicated to guide their actions. If that communication is unclear, their actions become misaligned, not because they lack ability, but because they lack understanding. In business, customers rely on what is communicated to make decisions. If the message is unclear, they hesitate, not because they are unwilling, but because they are uncertain. In ministry, people rely on the communication of truth to shape their beliefs. If that communication is unclear, their understanding becomes unstable. An unstable understanding leads to inconsistent application. In each case, clarity determines whether trust is strengthened or weakened. There is also a compounding effect to this. Clear communication builds trust over time. Each moment of clarity reinforces confidence. Each clear message strengthens the relationship between the communicator and the audience. But confusion also compounds. Each unclear message introduces a small amount of doubt. Each moment of uncertainty weakens confidence. And over time, these small moments accumulate until trust is no longer stable. This is why clarity must be consistent. It is not enough to be clear occasionally. It must be a pattern. This connects directly to your work on clarity as a strategic asset. In the cinematic strategist, you argue that trust is not abstract. It is measurable. It has real impact on outcomes. It affects how people respond, how they engage, and how they decide. Clarity is what enables that trust to form. Without clarity, even the most well-intentioned communication struggles to produce results. Because trust cannot be built on what is not understood. This is why clarity is not separate from influence. It is foundational to it. There is also a need for awareness. Influence can be subtle. It can grow gradually. And as it grows, the responsibility attached to it increases. What you say begins to carry more weight than before. People begin to take your words more seriously. They begin to act on what you communicate. This is where care is required, because unclear communication at this level does not only create confusion, it creates consequences. People may act on incomplete understanding. They may interpret your words in unintended ways. They may make decisions based on what they think you meant. And if clarity is not present, the result may not align with your intention. This is why stewardship matters. Clarity requires intentionality. It requires the willingness to think before speaking, to structure ideas carefully, to ensure that what is being communicated can be understood accurately. It also requires feedback, not assuming that people understand, but confirming it, not relying on expression alone, but paying attention to reception. Because influence is not about what you say, it is about what is received. There is also a personal dimension to this. To communicate clearly, you must think clearly. To think clearly, you must understand deeply. This requires time, reflection, and discipline. It requires slowing down enough to refine what you are saying, to remove what is unnecessary, to focus on what matters. This is not always convenient, but it is necessary, because clarity does not happen by accident. Take a moment to reflect. Where do people trust your voice? Where are people relying on what you say? And how clear is your communication in those areas? Are you building trust through clarity or weakening it through confusion? These questions matter a lot, because influence is not something you own. It is something you are entrusted with. The stewardship of influence is the stewardship of clarity. If you are trusted, you must be clear. If you are heard, you must be understood. Because what you communicate does not end with you. It continues in the minds, decisions, and actions of those who receive it. Clarity builds trust. Confusion destroys it. And over time, this determines the strength of your influence.